Welcome to The Art of Investment, a podcast series brought to you by the wealth management boutique Vermeer Partners. I'm your host, Paul Dixey, and we've created this series to shed light on some of the topics running hot in the investment community today. With insights from industry experts in their own golden eras, we reveal some of the issues investors face in today's often complex investment world. Whether you are a seasoned industry professional or an enthusiast beginning their investment journey, we hope you gain some valuable insights and enjoy this series along the way. Thank you for listening. The information provided during the podcast does not constitute investment advice, and please listen to our full disclosure at the end of the show. Now, energy security is right at the top of the economic agenda right now. Soaring prices of natural gas have forced governments across Europe to intervene in energy markets, with consumers and businesses feeling the squeeze more than ever. So, what can we do to make sure we don't find ourselves in this position again? How can we become energy independent so we're not at the mercy of Putin? Well, to talk me through the various solutions on the Art of Investment podcast this week is Richard Lung. Richard is a managing partner and co-chief investment officer at Victory Hill Capital Partners. Richard oversees origination and portfolio management at Victory Hill and has over 26 years of experience. We've known Richard now for a couple of years, ever since the Victory Hill Global Sustainable Energy Opportunities Fund listed in London 2021. So without further ado, Richard, welcome to the Art of Investment podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Paul. How are you?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Great to have you on the show. Today, we'll be asking you about the energy crisis affecting each and every one of us right now, why the sustainability issue is much bigger than just renewables, and are taxes on the energy sector a sensible idea? I'll also ask you what we need to be doing in the UK to become more energy independent, and plus much, much more, I'm sure. But before that, my usual opening question, Richard, when you think of the great financiers and business people you admire and look up to, what qualities do you think they possess?
Oh, wow. What a great opening question. And not that, I spend much of my time pondering great financiers and business people, but there are certain characteristics that have come across, reading some of the biographies of some of these guys. Look, I think certainly the ability for financiers and business people really to think at scale right at the outset of the business that they're looking to implement. It's very important. And something that I admire a great deal is the ability of individuals and entrepreneurs really to become some of the great entrepreneurs of our time, actually, to have an idea, but not only think about the idea in isolation and wonder at its beauty, but actually understand how scalable it is. And some of the greatest businesses that we've seen, particularly in finance, actually, have come out and grown apace because of the ambition of its founders to think about how they could achieve scale, in the shortest possible space of time, but also connecting dots to enable them to do so, whether that's the ability to commercialize something better or understand, the economics of how something could work in greater detail. It's really the idea of getting out of being a garage band and getting into the stadium sooner rather than later. I really admire people who are able to do that.
And when we spoke before the podcast, Richard, you mentioned that energy markets, you said that they had been a source of inspiration for you. Could you tell us a bit more about this and what initially attracted you to a career in energy?
No, absolutely. So I think energy is one of these fundamental needs that we have in society. Throughout the ages, we needed to have heat, warmth, some form of power to enable industry, etc. There's just a great lineage there of why energy was so important to society, even more so to developing economies. Having energy independence has always been and continues to be a key facet of growing economies outside of the developed world. My childhood came out of living and I was born in New Zealand. However, I come from a Malaysian family. I grew up in Malaysia for a large chunk of my childhood, understanding, countries such as Malaysia and Southeast Asia and how their economies have grown, really being precipitated by the ability for the governments to have access and ownership and stewardship of their energy resources. Having that understanding and seeing how that could influence positively, but also if mismanaged could also be their downfall. Really very intriguing for somebody like me who has grown up in an emerging economy, but also transitioned over to the UK at a very early age as well, and understood it, from the other perspective of investment into these areas. So always been a real inspiration for me in terms of understanding that geopolitical element of energy and what it does to emerging economies and how it can be best utilized for the benefit of most people.
And before we get into the crux of the chat today, Richard, so what you've been doing in the fund recently to accelerate the energy transition, I have to ask you about the energy crisis that's unfolding in front of our very eyes. Obviously, Putin is weaponizing the supply of natural gas, and because obviously Europe are highly dependent on natural gas, the winter doesn't look particularly promising. So could you maybe sort of reflect on where we are, and what are the chances, do you think, of us avoiding a severe energy crisis this winter?
Yeah, look, it's a pretty significant phenomenon we're experiencing right now, which is to do with the potential restriction, or actual restriction of natural resources into the economies of Western Europe, and by extension also to the global economies. It's not something, however, that is not being contemplated in the past. This is something, the idea of resource and nationalization, the need for certain countries to use their resources as a means of a political extension, is not new. And we've seen this repeated many occasions in other markets, such as in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, etc. And of course, in the Middle East in the 70s. The idea that Russia has a significant reserves of natural gas that can power, Europe and the rest of the world. It is one of the largest producers in the world, and the consequential risk that it may at any time seek to restrict its supply has been in the consciousness of the energy industry for many, many years. And in fact, over the last decade, we've seen them intervene in particular ways to try to, as it were, flex their muscles, and Putin in particular flexed his muscles, particularly with the likes of renationalizing, for example, Rosneft, their national energy company. This has always been on the horizon. There's always been the implicit risk here. And I think what we've seen is a lot of the Western European, in particular, energy-dependent economies have sought to further pluralize their source of energy. We're talking about the likes of Scandinavian countries, Norway upping their production of natural gas from fields. We're talking about importation from other parts of the world, including West Africa and the Middle East, starting to come into the UK and other Western European markets, at least for the last decade, but not in great quantities. And we've also seen there be initiatives by the large integrated energy companies to seek natural gas supplies from Central Asia via a southern route. We've heard about the Nord Stream pipeline, Nord Stream 1 and the proposed Nord Stream 2. There were southern routes also that came into and are coming into Western Europe as well, including the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. This has been played out over the last decade or so. Consequentially, moves are already in place to try to more pluralize these supplies. And that really is at the crux of how potentially economies in Western Europe can help stabilize this inflationary impact of Russian natural gas. However unfortunate it is, everybody will feel an effect of this. And of course, there is now a move, the energy transition, the move towards net zero that involves significant investment in renewable technology that will also add to this diversification away from traditional sources of natural gas coming from Russia, albeit the impact that we would see in the short term would probably be muted. In the longer term, the combination of this renewable power generation coming online that doesn't involve natural gas, combined with some form of storage as well to provide an alternative, more sustainable energy system, which I'm can talk about later, would help diversify away from the effects of Russia and its constraints on natural gas supplies.
And diversify away seems pretty sensible to me. So let's look to the future and hopefully a sustainable one that is ahead of us. I've heard you say previously that the whole sustainability issue is bigger than just renewable energy. Perhaps you could sort of clear up that common misconception for us.
No, look, absolutely. Look, I think we can all agree that the transition to net zero does and will continue to depend on significant investment in renewable power generation, in renewable technology. It's very, very important to all economies that we invest more money and capital into this area. And I think the International Energy Agency estimates that between 2020 and 2040, a further $40 trillion of investment is required in this area. However, investing purely in renewable generation itself will not result in a fully sustainable energy system. And the reason for that, as we broadly realize now, is that core renewable technologies such as wind and solar are somewhat intermittent. So if there is a lack of wind yield to power your wind turbines and potentially lack of sunlight or radiation to power your solar panels, then the system gets stuck in terms of the supply of electricity. It's very intermittent. It goes up and down according to ambient conditions. And in those situations, the grid operator would still need to call on more conventional, however more pollutive sources of power, such as coal-fired power plants, for example, or unabated gas-fired power plants. And this is the crux of it. If we are able to, in some way, invest in renewable technology, but also other technologies that help the transition, that help smooth out and firm the grid. We're talking about, storage technology, for example. We're talking about the likes of gas-fired power plants, perhaps with carbon capture on them to provide a net zero solution. And we're talking about other things outside of just electrification. We talk about fuels as well. You have to bear in mind, long distance flights will not be accomplished using batteries anytime soon. They will still need to use some form of fuels. However, looking to decarbonize those fuels is a challenge in itself that doesn't relate specifically to renewable technology. And all the infrastructure around handling of those fuels, such as storage terminals, such as pipelines, such as vessels to ship them, again, will require investment if we are to make an impact in this area. So that's really what I mean when we talk about sustainability and the sustainable energy system requiring a viewpoint that is wider than just renewable energy. And I think that is, really that's a truism. And it's something that as investors, we need to stimulate further awareness of this fact.
Now, you and the team, you focus on investments that have a high value impact. Could you, Richard, explain what you mean by that? And perhaps you could sort of describe how you put this into practice with one of your recent investments.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Look, what we're trying to do here is aligning ourselves with a standard that we believe encapsulates global sustainability, which we believe is the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. Now, on the one hand, this framework is very much committed to supporting a transition to net zero carbon, the energy transition. And on the other hand, it also acknowledges the fact that in tandem with providing clean or renewable energy, we also need to supply the growing demand for energy in various parts of the world. And various parts of the world are currently undertaking their transition in different ways that may not correlate with what we're seeing here in Western Europe and the UK. Now, in Western Europe and the UK, outside of the recent Ukrainian conflict, the big talking point is we need to expand renewable power generation. That is the fundamental precept of sustainable investing in relation to energy. In other parts of the world, however, for example, in Mexico, sustainability currently means ensuring that you have the public has access to affordable energy, but that actually affordable energy that doesn't create a public health hazard, because over there it is still very much a fuel dependent economy for a large part of its its industry. They rely on long haulage transportation that still relies on fuel. It's unlikely to be driven anytime soon by electric vehicles or batteries over long distances. Still need some sort of type of fuels, but the fuels are heavily pollutive, and they're experiencing local phenomena such as acid rain, which we haven't seen in Europe for many, many decades, actually probably the last 5 decades or so. So that's what the energy transition means to them, is to first of all deal with the public health hazard of reducing their usage of dirtier fuels to cleaner fuels in their economies, and also by extension dealing with the consequential reduction in airborne pollution as a result of that, and in CO2 pollution as well, but not the other way around. CO2 pollution in itself is one of the objectives, but it's not the sole objective as it would be in the UK or Western Europe. So there's a difference there. And we seek to make that impact through our investments, such as those we're undertaking in Latin America at the moment. We don't believe that just because we're in the UK, we should just be focused on the way we do things in Western Europe. We need to look outside of only one region, because the transition transition and global sustainability, it is a global issue and you need to make an impact. We could wait, for example, for the likes of Brazil or Mexico to become the next Sweden and then think now we're able to interact with them, or we can make an impact there now, which is what we seek to do. Now, in relation to Brazil and the latest acquisition that we made there, that we've announced of a hydropower plant, we're looking to participate in the further expansion of renewable power generation within the country. Brazil has significant hydrological resources. Hydropower assets are some large ones are pretty common in Brazil. It forms part of their energy mix there. And of course, hydro facilities have a natural storage capability. So it complements the inherent intermittency of renewables like solar. Put them together and you have a more sustainable energy system. And that is the way we're looking to participate in Brazil, through acquiring a large 198 megawatts hydro facility from EDP, the Portuguese utility there, in terms of firming the grid and ensuring there's greater penetration of renewables in that system.
Now, I was listening to Sir Keir Starmer very recently, Richard, and he was saying that Labour's 2030 aims are to double the amount of onshore wind, triple solar, and quadruple offshore wind power. And rightly, the interviewer, Laura Kuenssberg, challenged him and said, asked him what happens if the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. Now, you've mentioned just a moment ago energy storage to deal with that intermittency problem that Laura was asking about. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what you're doing in this regard, and also sort of what are the dynamics at play here, and how important is energy storage moving forwards?
I think energy storage is pretty important to a sustainable system, but we're talking about a variety of solutions in that area, and we're also talking about the ability to firm the grid, to provide power generation from a more conventional source, for example, such as natural gas. If we are able to capture the CO2 on the other side in some way, whether it's through carbon capture and storage, or the scheme that we're currently investing in, which is carbon capture, and we scrub the CO2 into a purified food grade CO2 that can then be supplied to the food and beverage industry, to the industrial gases market there, for usage in production of food and beverage. There is a chronic shortage of that type of product in the food and beverage industry, so we're making an impact there as well. So it's what we call net zero flexible power part of the equation, and then there is the storage part. And in the storage part, we're all very much aware of battery storage technology. Battery storage will complement coming in and providing some type of firming, but very much in the short end of the time scale. We're talking anywhere between sub-second up to minutes, fundamentally, and you can store energy in the battery from anywhere between 1 and 2 hours. What we need to get to, however, is other technologies that would provide firming and storage over a longer duration. And here we're talking about anywhere between 6 hours above to 8 hours or so. That would require other types of technology not currently available with batteries. We're talking about using gravity, for example, as a form of storage technology. The most obvious example of that would be where we have pump hydro systems. You let the water run from a top reservoir to a bottom reservoir, and through doing so run a generator. If you want to generate power, you run a pump to pump it back up to the top reservoir when you want to store power. That's the most fundamental way of looking at it. But there are other technologies out there, for example, such as compressed air technology or liquefied air technology, or indeed pump storage using disused mine shafts, that can cater for this type of solution. However, they need to have the support of leadership in government to provide some form of enabling legislation to allow them to exist at a scalable basis. And that's really what's missing when politicians are queried on this issue. They would rather think about just renewable power generation, full stop, and the big numbers going into there, as opposed to considering the other areas where they need to provide leadership, need to provide some form of underwriting in order for investment to go in, including long duration storage.
Now, Richard, I'm sure you're an avid listener to the Art Investor podcast.
Of course.
Yeah, of course. In recent episodes, we've been talking a lot about inflation. Obviously, investors are clamoring for assets that deliver returns that can perhaps keep up with inflation. You've spoken to us previously about how the fund and some of the assets do offer investors some protection against inflation risk. So could you please tell us a bit more about that?
No, absolutely. Look, I mean, we invest globally. We invest in markets, energy markets specifically, where we believe there is a form of structural demand gaps that need filling through investment. And it's through that tension, really, of being able to invest in something that provides a fundamental need that is currently not being covered, that we are able to secure, long-term revenue contracts under these that have a linkage, an uncapped linkage to inflation in the local currencies that we're investing in, whether it's in Brazil through our distributed solar power PV sites, or in the US, where we're invested in fuel storage terminals that have contract with the national energy company in Mexico. This is the project where we're looking to make an impact on the fuels value chain in Mexico. That is also inflation linked. The fact that they're able and willing to provide these types of revenue contracts speaks to the fact that there is a structural gap that we're able to fill through our investments, which is slightly different if you were to invest in the we believe highly saturated areas of core renewables in Western Europe, and in particular in the UK, where those types of contracts are no longer available to that extent. We look for differentiated investment opportunities that offer our shareholders a differentiated return too.
And a question we often get asked by our clients here at Vermeer Partners, Richard, is whether owning shares in the energy majors is a help or a hindrance to the energy transition. You've worked in both conventional energy markets such as oil and gas, and now obviously you're working in the renewables. Love to hear what your view is on that debate.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty contentious area, I would say, from my previous experience here. But there's a couple of points I'd like to unpack there. The first, most obvious comment, as an investment trust ourselves, VH Global Sustainable Energy Opportunities is directly responsible to shareholders for its very visible investments in sustainable energy infrastructure. There's no doubting, no lack of visibility as to what it is we're investing in and the type of impact we want to make and the type of shareholder returns we're able to generate by doing so. I think as you expand into the area of large energy majors and owning equity in them, there is much more of a fungibility to the capital that they have and what can be deployed for. So, that's one clear observation I can make. There's perhaps a little bit less, I wouldn't say transparency, but visibility in terms of how they're affecting the energy transition. They pay a lot of lip service to their rhetoric about how they're moving, but clearly they are motivated by shareholder returns in the first instance, doing what they do most naturally, which is the conventional oil and gas activities. Now, the second thing I would note, however, having said the first thing, the second thing I would note is we still need participation from the energy majors in affecting the energy transition for a whole host of reasons, including the fact, and this is not something that is necessarily always known to the market, is they are the underwriters of much investment in renewable technologies that are undertaken by third parties. You have projects that are undertaken by other investors, including such as VH Global Sustainable Energy Opportunities PLC, for example, investing in a project that may well be commercialized under a revenue contract that is offered by one of these large energy majors. And in doing so, they de-risk the underlying proposition of the project itself. So there is a very critical, albeit indirect, way in which they participate in the energy transition itself.
Turning our attention closer to home, to the UK, Richard, our new Prime Minister has promised to reform the energy market by doing a couple of things. One, encouraging more North Sea exploration. And secondly, to also restart fracking. But in your view, what do we need to do in the UK to have greater energy security moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, these are quite populist moves, aren't they? If I'm able to say that. You do need to strike a balance between going all out on populist ticket and actually understanding and implementing a more balanced approach to energy independence, or certainly to pluralizing your energy mix. And I think this is a little bit of a short-sighted move by the administration on just focusing on reintroducing fracking encouraging more North Sea exploration. There's much more that needs to be invested in across the energy value chain to ensure a sustainable energy system, including, as I mentioned earlier, investments required in longer duration storage. And if we can crack that nut, that would really help us in terms of storing that renewable power over a longer duration, over days, maybe even weeks, so that we can dispatch it when there isn't, sunlight, or there isn't so much wind yields, and without the need to revert to the primary fuel sources such as oil and gas. So I think it's a little bit, short-termist driven, and I would have expected much more out of this current administration.
Yeah, and there's also been quite a bit of noise regarding nuclear, Richard. Is there space for nuclear, do you think, in our energy mix moving forwards?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's been a lot of discussion around nuclear. Nuclear takes a lot of discussion. It takes a lot of willpower as well to implement, and a lot of capital. Having been exposed to financing conventional energy projects in the past, I can safely tell you that commissioning a nuclear power plant takes, on average, about a decade, if not longer, from initially conceptualizing it, and getting a significant amount of capital on board as well. So there are risks there. As Victory Hill, generally speaking, our position is we don't believe nuclear in its current fashion is sustainable. It doesn't generate any carbons when it generates power. However, there are question marks about how the materials used in the commissioning of the plant, and certainly the fuels that are used and how they get disposed of. That doesn't speak to a sustainable objective. So, we would rather that type of capital be spent on firming up other parts of the energy system, including, as I mentioned before, further investment in storage.
Just on governments, obviously throughout Europe have been debating obviously the pros and cons of increasing taxes on energy companies. We now have the energy profits levy, for example, here in the UK. What are your views on sort of taxes and higher taxes on the energy sector? Is it a sensible idea, do you think, moving forwards?
Well, I think certainly the largest energy players within, for example, the UK, and we're talking about the likes of the large integrated energy companies like BP, et cetera, have come out and said this would not dissuade them from investing further in the sector. That gives you an idea as to the types of targets that they're focused on as global businesses. It's always a political football that these outsized profits need to be taxed. And, there's a lot, I have a lot of sympathy with the idea of, in this current climate where people will be suffering as a result of the higher energy prices, that these people should not be experiencing a windfall. However, I have to also balance that out with the functioning of our energy market currently, where you might have the price of natural gas brought on by the Ukrainian conflict having a volatile period and having a upward shock, resulting in a exponentially higher power price because of the functioning of the carbon tax within the power price itself. Whether that's a sensible way of actually alleviating the burden on the end user, fundamentally, who has to pay for this. So really question marks from my perspective as to whether that's the right thing to do, or whether indeed, instead of taxing with a energy profits levy on the electricity generation sector, you in effect remove that carbon tax element of the power price.
In our preparation meeting, we chatted a bit about diversity within teams, and I really enjoyed listening to the reasons behind that and why it's so important for you all at Victory Hill. Perhaps you could share that with our listeners, Richard.
Oh, yeah, no, absolutely. Our approaches and our views are pretty simple. The greater amount of diversity you can have in your team, you're effectively creating as most optimized and large talent pool in terms of experiences, in terms of insight, and in terms of knowledge. Now, we came together, fundamentally, the managing partners who set the firm up, as a bunch of guys who, some of whom came out of banking, some of whom came out of the corporate sector, but all who had different backgrounds and disciplines, core disciplines, whether it was in finance. I myself have spent many years investing in financing infrastructure. We had guys from M&A, guys from asset management, etc. And we all brought differences of perspective to a particular problem. Now, of course, having a more diverse workforce enables you to grow that even further and have more eyes and more different perspectives on particular problems or indeed opportunities. And that really unlocks the potential to be much more effective in terms of the positions that we do take and the types of opportunities that we do show our shareholders. So it's a very, very clear calculus for us, really, reaching out and finding the best possible talent, irrespective, of their backgrounds, but welcoming people for their potential insights is something that we do encourage.
Now to the quick fire round. And my first question, Richard, is very simply, what do you enjoy most about your job?
Well, that would actually relate to my previous comments. Actually, being in an environment with different people of different backgrounds and listening to them and learning from them is unarguably the best part of my job, hands down.
And we have a lot of young men and women listening to the podcast. What would be your one piece of advice to them?
I would say do not be put off by first experiences of tapping into the industry. Follow your heart and back yourself, fundamentally. There is a whole array of institutions and functions that require your talent. You can be assured of that. Keep knocking.
And two people, and they could be past or present, who you'd most like to meet and why?
Well, the first person is actually Barack Obama. I would love to meet the guy. Having understood his trajectory and understanding the philosophy that he brought to the White House, his ability to bring people of different philosophies and certainly trying to work with the other side of the aisle is something that I find, particularly attractive, and just trying to understand how he's able to do that. And by the same token, the other person I'd like to meet as well is another American president, actually, which is Abraham Lincoln, who pretty much did a similar job, but in more trying circumstances a few centuries ago. Having to deal with a particular challenge by reaching out to people who may not necessarily be your foremost advocate, and making them see from your perspective, really bridging that gap really is something that I aspire to.
Yeah, two quite extraordinary people there. And finally, your one business or finance book you would encourage our listeners to go away and read?
Yeah, look, I've throughout my time in energy have been fortunate enough to understand the background of how the energy industry came to the fore. There is a book called The Prize, which is quite a vast tome, I have to say. It took me a while to read it, about the formation of the energy industry throughout the many decades. And it's written by a well-known economist in the energy area called Daniel Yergin. And I was fortunate enough at one time to actually met Daniel, at an event held by an energy company, and he was doing a debate, etc. And it's a phenomenal book. It gives you a clear idea as to how the modern energy system came about and the risks that were involved. And yeah, amazing. And it gives you an idea as to how things like Russia under Putin currently and the resource nationalization there, operates.
Okay, well, that sounds like a fascinating read. I'll certainly link to that in the show notes. Richard, it's been an absolute joy listening to you there. So many things to take away from it. I think one of the most interesting things that sort of struck a chord with me was how, listening to all the projects that you've been investing in, it sort of symbolizes how each country's energy market is very different, and a sort of one size fits all approach to, accelerating the energy transition will just not work. I absolutely loved the advice you gave. Follow your heart and back yourself. I thought that was fantastic. And I just wanted to thank you very much for being so generous with your time. And we hope to see you soon, Richard.
It's been a pleasure, Paul. Thank you very much for having me on. Yeah, I look forward to speaking to you guys again soon.
Thank you for listening, and I really hope you enjoyed today's show. If you'd like to find out more about what we discussed today, please visit the show notes, or alternatively, get in touch via our website at vermeerllp.com. The information provided during this podcast does not constitute investment advice. It should not be considered a recommendation to buy or an offer to sell a security or investment. Guests and presenters may have positions in any of the investments discussed. Investors should remember that the value of investments and the income from them can go down as well as up. You may not recover what you invest. Past performance is no guarantee of future performance, and your capital is at risk.